Hello class, welcome to Public Law session number 11 with me, and this will be part 2 of the House of Lords topic. Now, not to worry if you're concerned whether this is a continuation of part 1. You don't have to watch part 1 first, it's all right. Part 1 was the 2019 question. I finished with that. Now part 2 is just looking at another sample examination question on the House of Lords. So it's not the continuation of an answer. You don't have to worry about that. Okay. Now before I start, I hope that you're all well, that you are healthy and fine, and that everything is all right with you. And I hope that you are finding this series of videos helpful in your understanding of public law. Without further ado, I'd like to now move to look at this question, and I am on the House of Lords handout, and I would be at the top of page 6. So page 1 to 5 was the first answer that I've given you. That's the 2019 question. I now come to the top of page 6, sample examination question on the House of Lords. Look at the question, please. I've highlighted it in yellow. Consider the, if you look at where my cursor is, the principles upon which the House of Lords is presently composed. Now, we spoke about composition in our last video. Composition means membership, who is in the House of Lords. All right, so who is, in other words, the House of Lords, who presently sits there, presently composed. And the second part is on the desirability of future reform. Okay, so if you look at the last couple of years, this has become topical and fashionable again, so to speak. So I would recommend for you to do this topic. And I also want to say that many people leave out the topic of the House of Lords. So therefore, in my opinion, those who do it, you stand a better chance really to get a good mark, because not many people would attempt a reform of House of Lords question. All right, don't be scared of it. As long as you go through various issues, which I'm going to take you through now, you should be comfortable to do this type of question. All right, now the general remarks, law cases, reports and references. I've actually added on some of the references that a good answer would look at, so you can look at those in your own time. Some common errors which the University of London has indicated, and a good answer to this question. What would it look at? So for example, it would discuss not only the functions but the purpose of a second chamber. Why do we have one? What is the constitutional role of a second chamber? Is it necessary? My answer will argue that it is. If so, and this is the second part, should it be reformed to be more representative? By now you will know that one of the issues concerning reform of the House of Lords is about its composition. The fact that the House of Parliament, one of the higher House of Parliament, is entirely unelected. Is that a viable or is that an admirable way to be in the 21st century, or is it something which is obsolete, an anachronism in the 21st century? Okay, should we reform the House? Should it be, if you look at that under a good answer, should it be more representative? Should there be a part of the House of Lords or an element of the House of Lords that's perhaps elected? What are the arguments for and against? What happens when the House of Commons and House of Lords disagree? Something which has become topical in the last couple of years, particularly after the Cameron government of 2015, the issue of veto power of delegated legislation. Should the House of Lords have this? This issue became controversial in 2015, and it has resulted in the Strathclyde Review and Report at the end of 2015, and we will look at what that says. So I've put there, a very good answer would discuss the House of Lords' retention of the legal veto over secondary legislation, recent controversy leading to the Strathclyde Review, and proposals for removal of that veto. Now, the examiner's report didn't actually have this, I've added it because I think that an excellent answer should consider that. All right. So the examiner's report sometimes gives you the basics. You must go above and beyond that, especially with reform. Think about what other people have said about reform. Think about the reforms that have happened in the past. And most importantly, think about what do you think would be a good method of reform. Sometimes you might think that you don't know the answer. For example, if somebody was to ask, what would be the best way to deal with the COVID situation? Not everybody would have the same answer, would they? But it would be acceptable to have different approaches, so we can look at those approaches and then come to a conclusion. So that's what I would do. Look at different methods or proposals for reform and then come to a conclusion. Which one you would prefer? So let's have, that's just an overview. Let's break this down into several areas. Okay, now how I would do this, and I've used highlighters to help you in this because we don't have a board. So in a sense, these notes is my whiteboard. So I'm using color really as a form of marking. So my first area in my answer, the first part of my answer, under suggested approach, yes, will be respond. This is what I always tell you, and this is really important. So respond to the question. Okay, so number one, respond to the question. Let's just put that. There we are. That numbering went a bit funny. So there we are. So under suggested approach, so number one, respond to the question. Number two, bottom of page 6, what are the principles upon which the House of Lords is presently composed of? Number three, the importance of the House of Lords and some of its unique characteristics. Once I've done that, I'm done with the first. Then I go to reform. Okay. My answer has more on reforms. I've put a lot on reform here because the question requires us to critically evaluate the issue of reform. So looking at reform, the first one that we will look at, and I'm going to highlight this, okay, so that you know how important this is the Parliament Act of 1911 and 1949. All right, that is the first attempt and the most important attempt at reforming the powers of the House of Lords. So that is something that we will look at. And then other examples on reform, and should we have an elected upper chamber? What are some of the reasons? A. Once I'm done with that, I come to B. Rebuttal arguments. Why we can say that it may not be a good idea to have a fully elected house. Perhaps we should go for a partially elected house. Once I'm done with that, I would look at some academic views, number 5. And then number 6, I would look at number 6 and 7, I would look at the past 2 decades. The Wakeham recommendations, it's very important. And then in the last 20 years, what's happened, right? And the answer is there's been a stalemate. They've not been able to agree on what to do next. And then the recent controversy, 2015, the disagreement between the House of Commons and House of Lords over the issue of tax credits, and the Strathclyde report. And that brings us nicely to the last page, which is page 11, and the last proposal for reform, the Lord Speaker's Committee, which is on the size of the House of Lords, and that's 2017. And then come to my conclusion on what would be my preferred method for reform. So that gives you an idea of the breakdown and the structure of my answer. Let us now go back to page 6, please. So the first thing to do, respond to the question and to indicate to the examiner that you are aware that there are 2 issues. A, the principles upon which the House of Lords is presently composed, and secondly, the desirability of future reform. This answer will argue on that the first, the principles upon which the House of Lords is presently composed, is myriad. There are many principles, and we will now go to look at what these principles are, looking at number 2. The first is that it's the UK has a bicameral parliament, a bicameral legislature. So one of the main principles upon which the House of Lords is based is a bicameral parliament, which means that its job is to revise bills, to scrutinize the executive. So it's a revising mechanism, a scrutiny mechanism of both legislative, all right, issues, whether it's bills or laws, all right, and scrutiny of the executive function. So which means that the House of Lords is based upon a principle whereby it is a checks and balance mechanism. It is a revising chamber. It is also a lawmaking chamber, right? And the relationship between the House of Commons and the House of Lords is one where there is primacy given to the House of Commons, and that is set out as a result of the Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949. All right, and why the House of Lords is so important, I come now to number 3, because this upper chamber acts as a complementary house to the House of Commons. It's a revising chamber. They're not too persuaded by party whips. They take a more neutral stand. Okay, they don't have the procedures that are there in the House of Commons to curb scrutiny of bills. For example, kangaroo motions, guillotine motions. The House of Lords doesn't have all these things, which means that debates and scrutiny mechanisms in the House of Lords are of a much higher caliber. Also, of course, because of the membership of the House of Lords, you have persons who are far more skilled in terms of expertise, all right? And if you look at that next point there, they're not accountable to the nation. Sure, you may tell me that's a weakness, but paradoxically, I could tell you that's also a strength, isn't it? Because if you are not accountable to the nation, you have more time, you have more energy, you have more commitment and stamina to be able to do what? To act as a scrutiny mechanism on the government itself. So that's very important. And also the composition of the House of Lords is such that the majority are life peers. Many are also crossbenchers, almost a fifth of the House of Lords, which means that many of them are not affiliated to any particular political party, which makes them more neutral and objective. So they end up being this, the voice of the nation. I put here the constitutional guardian, a checks and balance mechanism. So tie this back to the question. These are all the principles upon which the House of Lords is based upon. Now we come to the next part of the question, which is on reform. The first thing that I will tell the examiner, I'm now on point number 4 on page, let's have a look, that's page 7, okay? Looking at reform, I would indicate to the examiner that I'm aware that some reforms have already taken place. The first, and perhaps most important, is this one, the Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949, which have ended up delaying the powers of legislation. So that means that no more veto power for the House of Lords. If they don't like a bill coming from the House of Commons, what can they do about it? It depends. If it's a money bill, maximum 30 days. If it's a non-money bill, it used to be 2 years after 1911. That's now been reduced to maximum 1 year after the 1949 Act. And the last time we saw this in operation was with the hunting bill in 2003. The next reform on composition, the most important one, was on composition. So the Parliament Acts are a reform on powers. The Life Peerages Act, this one, I'm going to put that, highlight that as well so that you can see that nicely. The Life Peerages Act, hang on a minute there, that didn't capture that properly. The Life Peerages Act is something that reformed the composition, isn't it? Because what did that do? It allowed for the first time peers to be appointed into the House of Lords, injecting new blood into the House of Lords. And that was a very good thing. The House of Lords Act of 1999, which removed hereditary peers from being in the House of Lords, leaving just 92 for a temporary period, right? For a temporary period. So these were all some of the reforms that have already happened. But the thing is this, When the HOLA, House of Lords Act of 1999 happened, that was meant to be part one of reform of the House of Lords. Now, what about part two? The Blair government at the time, they were not clear about what would happen next. So we're left in a sense with a limbo, and that limbo has carried on for the last 20 years. A question to ask for the future is, should the House of Lords be elected? Why? Because if it is elected, it would be more democratic. It would be more representative. So we have got two important reasons here: democratic, representative, and a third one, accountable. Democracy, representation, accountability. Now, let's explore these ideas. Let's first look at what are some of the reasons why the House of Lords should have a system where, or rather, let me rephrase that. What are the reasons to have a fully elected upper chamber? The first one, as I said just now, the first most compelling reason would be for democracy. For democratic reasons, there must be electoral legitimacy for them to have a democratic mandate, that they are elected, and that their mandate to govern stems from the fact that they are elected. The second reason, statistics. Very few democratic countries in the world today have a predominantly nominated second chamber. The third reason, as I said just now, is a political reason, because reform of the House of Lords has been in limbo for so long. Finish the business. Next, modernization. To come up with a House of Lords which is a modern house in line with the 21st century. To be more representative. I come now to page 8, class. To be a voice of the nation. And lastly, to be accountable to the public. These are very important reasons why we can say that the House of Lords should be elected. Let's now come to other opposing reasons, to look at the other side of the coin. What are some reasons to rebut that, to say that we should not have a fully elected House, but perhaps we should have a partially elected House? A partially elected House. All right? Now, why should we have a partially elected House? Well, the first reason is that if we have a fully elected House, then this would be a duplication of the House of Commons. What's the point of having two House of Commons? And also, it would create unnecessary competition and rivalry between these two houses. That would defeat the purpose. We don't want that. The second reason here, to have a fully elected House of Lords would destroy the character of Parliament as we know it today. And this is Lord Bingham's argument. We know Parliament, and he said this in his article, The House of Lords, Its Future. Right? And he said this several years ago, but his argument still rings essentially true, which is that we know Parliament as it is today as a bicameral system. If we're going to have two houses that are going to be elected, won't we need another electoral system then for the House of Lords? Is that worth it? Would it be too much of a break in the past? Would it cost too much money? Would it waste taxpayer funds? Is it necessary? So a fully elected House of Lords, we go to the next reason, would threaten the predominance of the House of Commons, whereas a partially elected House may not. Next reason, a fully elected House of Lords could create a gridlock or a constitutional lock between the two houses. It could create a parliament that's at war with each other, and that's not a good thing for anyone. The next reason is that a fully elected House would change the nature and function of the House of Lords. At the moment, the House of Lords, if you look at the next point, the fact that it is not elected is what makes the House of Lords unique, what gives it strength. So maybe there's an argument to say that it's good that it's not elected. And also it allows it to be, that last point there, the freedom from party whip domination. So this is why, and I come now to number 5, the famous constitutional writer, the noted constitutional writer, Professor Dawn Oliver, in her article, Democracy, Parliament and Constitutional Watchdogs, she said that in the past, she has said that there are two possibilities for reform. The first, the second chamber could contain substantial numbers of independently appointed, non-elected members with the requisite skills and ability and non-partisan approach. This is what the Wakeham Commission proposed. Now she says, some people say it's democratic, but Dawn Oliver says it's not. She says that, and she compares to the French system, she says, what's wrong with having non-elected experts playing a scrutiny role in the legislation process? That's not undemocratic, she says. After all, they've got a modest power to delay legislation. That's okay. All right? And she says that this is a good thing because you have an intra-parliamentary scrutiny mechanism whereby the House of Lords acts as a checks and balance mechanism. Lord Bingham also gives us some points to talk about in his article, The House of Lords, Its Future, where he says that if you had elections, it's not a good thing. It will raise problems of its own, such as, for example, what would be the rules that govern the elections? Would these elections be held at the same time as general elections? Would these elected peers represent the same parliamentary constituencies as members of the House of Commons? Would the franchise be the same? What's the use of a carbon copy House of Commons? It would be a recipe, he says, for friction and obstruction. And that's a nice quote for you to use in your answer. And he says that the primacy of the House of Commons could be challenged in a way it has not been for centuries. And it's undesirable. The whole character and uniqueness of the House of Lords, he said, would be destroyed. So he's not in favor of election into the House of Lords. So he says that you would lose the character of the House of Lords, the important principles upon which it is currently based. Now, let's now go to some of the reform proposals. After the House of Lords Act of 1999, the Tony Blair Labour government set up the Wakeham Commission to look at reform part 2. And the Wakeham report was published in 2000, and the Wakeham report recommended several things. I've asked a question, did they favour 100% election? The answer is no. Did they favour a partially elected House? The answer is yes. What proportion elected, what proportion appointed? They did not say. What they said was they proposed a majority appointed. I repeat, a majority appointed. A significant minority to be elected. Now, after that, what happened? Well, there was a stalemate for a long time, more than a decade, and I've put that, is that the main controversy today? Well, it was for more than a decade because the political parties couldn't decide what was the proportion to be elected, what was the proportion to be appointed. And we come now to number 7, the last 2 decades. So what have been the developments since the Wakeham report recommendations? I've put at the end of page 9, notes that progress has not been made due to a lack of agreement or consensus. So you could refer to the July 2008 white paper, which recommended a large proportion of an elected second chamber, even 100 or 80%. But that was shot down, and that, there was a lack of consensus on that as well at the end of the day. So throughout the decade following the Wakeham Commission report, there was a lack of consensus on this. That brings us to the recent years. Well, I say recent, but the last decade. So you've got the Cameron-Clegg coalition government of 2010 to 2015. And the government at that time said that the second chamber should complement rather than rival the House of Commons. They didn't want to change any of the powers of the House of Commons. They said they should keep that. Now, and then what happened was something very interesting, which this should be in your answer, which was the disagreement that happened between the House of Commons and the House of Lords in the Cameron government of 2015. That is a Conservative government. Now, I've put here disagreement between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. This was on the issue of a conflict on the cut on tax credits. Now, what happened here was that the Conservative government wanted to cut certain tax credits in order to save money for the government. The House of Lords was not in favor of this. and it tried to block it. It tried to use its veto power over secondary legislation. This cut on tax credit was done by secondary legislation. So the Prime Minister, who was Mr. Cameron, David Cameron at the time, was very angry because he said, you guys are unelected, so why are you stopping something that is a financial issue? All right, you should be following the convention and you should not be blocking it. To which the House of Lords replied that the convention and indeed the Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949 only apply to primary legislation. So yes, they don't have a veto power over primary legislation, but they do have a veto power, they said, over secondary legislation. So that's why this issue has become examinable again, because the point is this, and the argument is this for us to raise: should the House of Lords have a veto power over secondary legislation? Now, David Cameron wanted to reduce the powers of the House of Lords, to remove powers over secondary legislation. And he was going to go ahead with that. He set up a commission, the Strathclyde Commission, to look into this, and that came up with a report in 2015, which brings me to page 11. Now, I've put here, consider, should the Lord's power of veto over delegated legislation be removed? And then I've asked the question, what were the recommendations of the Strathclyde report in 2015? Now, there were 3 recommendations, and you should know this already from class, but I will repeat them here. You might want to just write it down as a reminder. And what were the 3 options? The first was to take away, that means to retract the House of Lords' powers over SIs, delegated legislation, to take away their powers. The second recommendation was to maintain and codify the status quo. I repeat, to maintain and codify the status quo. The third recommendation was to come up with new legislation whereby statutory instruments, that means delegated legislation, would be treated like most legislation, whereby the Lords would lose their veto power, but they would be able to suggest amendments to the Commons, and the Commons would have the final say. And the Strathclyde report recommended the third option, that means removing the power of veto over secondary legislation and giving primacy to the House of Commons. Now, what happened after that? Well, what happened after that was that David Cameron stepped down, because after 2015, what happened? That's right, in 2016 was the EU referendum. So he stepped down. So he couldn't go any further with reducing the powers of the House of Lords. Theresa May came in. Now, when she came in, her biggest headache was Brexit. So the House of Lords was not a priority for her. So reform of powers of the House of Lords over delegated legislation has been put on hold. That's an excellent thing for you to bring up in your conclusion, whether you agree with the Strathclyde report, whether you feel that the third recommendation, take away that veto power for delegated legislation, reduce the House of Lords' powers over delegated legislation, give primacy to the House of Commons. If you agree with that third recommendation, state it in your conclusion. If you disagree, if you feel the House of Lords should carry on and you prefer the second recommendation, keep the status quo, maybe codify it, put it down, have a view. Don't be scared to take that view and put it down on paper. The last recommendation for reform is a non-controversial one. That's 2017. That's the Speaker here, the Lord Speaker's Committee, saying that we should reform the size of the House of Lords. Okay, and when he said this was October 2017, there were more than 800, there were 826 members. Now, 2.5 years later, we have less than 800, right? We have 792 at the moment. So the House of Lords members are reducing. How is that happening? That's not through legislation, that's through political will, whereby the Prime Minister is following the 2 out, 1 in principle to reduce the numbers of the House of Lords, so that eventually it will go down to a figure that is roughly 600 in order to be compatible with the House of Commons, which has 650 members. So that's a reform on size. Okay, so conclusion, that brings me to the bottom of page 11. So conclude on the principles upon which the House of Lords is presently composed, and do you think that the House of Lords should be reformed further? And what is your view? Do you think that that reform should be centered on composition, have an elected percentage, or don't have an elected percentage? Do what Wakeham suggested, majority appoint. So that's composition. Number 2, do you want to reduce the powers of the House of Lords? In which case you can go for the Strathclyde Review's 3rd recommendation. Take away their powers for veto of delegated legislation. All right. 3rd, do you want to reform the size? Are you agreeing with this Lord Speaker's Committee? And that's a pretty safe thing to talk about, unlike the Strathclyde Review, which is a lot more controversial. Conclude on what is your preferred method of reform. Let's say you're not convinced by any of these and you feel that the House of Lords should continue the way that it is. That's fine too. And you can use the Don Oliver approach, which I have given you on your page 9. There you are. I've put it in blue here. You can use this approach to substantiate your conclusion. All right, so don't be scared of this topic. You can do it. I hope that this video has helped you in understanding some of the main issues with House of Lords questions, and I wish you the best of luck in your coming examinations. I'm going to turn off the video now. I'm going to end it here. So bye-bye for now. Thank you.